there's not only a sense of God's people unified in a vertical dimension with pre-exilic Israel, but there's also a sense of unity in a horizontal dimension. In other words, they're unified among themselves. We see that already beginning in Ezra chapter 1, where even those who are staying behind are giving gifts and financing the trip to go back. There's a sense of everybody giving free will offerings and so on. I went to college in western Pennsylvania. Beaver Falls was the town. And in my college years, there was a sign that the Chamber of Commerce put out on the highway as you came into town. And it said, welcome to Beaver Falls. Said, welcome to Beaver Falls, where there's unity in the community. And progress is our most important value. Something like that. I think of this little dumb phrase every time I think of Ezra and Nehemiah. There's a unity in the body and taking care of each other, and everybody's doing together. They give free will offerings to let them go back in the first return back in Ezra. Under Nehemiah, remember, they find out, for example, in Nehemiah chapter 5, that there's problems among the people. Some people are having difficulty, and Nehemiah rallies the people, and especially the more affluent ones, and said, "Look, we're affluent, and we're getting more than our fair share. Let's give back. Let's provide." So he takes the lead in being generous himself. In chapter 11, there's a whole issue of the depopulation of Jerusalem. Everybody has sort of abandoned the city and moved to the suburbs. And they say in chapter 11, we need to repopulate the city. And they take volunteers. And volunteers volunteer to go back. There's prayer, and there's sort of a commissioning of these people that are going back. And so there's a wonderful sense of unity along in so many different areas in these two books. A third area of God's people is the whole idea of God's people still being separate. They're unified with pre-exilic Israel. They're unified among themselves, but they're to be separate from the pagan cultures and so on. And the most visible example of that, of course, is the putting away of the foreign wives in both books. It appears that Ezra and Nehemiah, remember, they overlap. Ezra returns in 458, Nehemiah returns in 445. They overlap somewhere because they're both there when they're reading the scriptures in Nehemiah 8. But it appears that they both face two different situations of intermarriage. So maybe it wasn't a complete separation in Ezra chapters 9 and 10. Or maybe in a period of 2 or 3 decades there had been more intermarriages, and Nehemiah had to deal with the issue again. Turn to chapter 13 of Nehemiah. And this is the chapter that is dated to 433 BC. It's the chapter of the last events in the Old Testament. And Nehemiah has come back from Persia, and he's discovered all kinds of problems in Jerusalem. One of my favorites is the second one there, starting in verse 4. And it turns out that the priest has rented out rooms in the temple to a guy named Tobiah. And Tobiah is living there. This is his apartment in the temple. And Nehemiah is outraged at this, and he deals with that and so on. But the whole chapter is about 8 different little issues that he's dealing with, one of which is in verse 23. In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they couldn't speak the language of Judah, but the language of each people. And I confronted and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. We read earlier, remember, when Ezra was informed of the intermarriage, what did he do? He pulled out his own hair. Nehemiah, a little different leadership style, pulls out their hair. So you can decide which is your calling in your ministries. Reading between the lines, it strikes me as Nehemiah's solution to the problem of intermarriage is not quite as harsh as Ezra's, because it doesn't specify saying he followed through on a mass divorce. All it says is the end of verse 25. I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. And then it goes on to talk about Solomon and so on. So it may have been that he was just saying, okay, we're going to grandfather in the existing marriages. Don't do it anymore. It might have been the point. But it's pretty clear in Ezra that there's this long list of, chapter 10 is the list of people that did have foreign wives that separated from them. Troy, did you have a question?
Yeah, like you were talking about the community and their desire for that strong community in Jerusalem, but I'm wondering if they were overzealous also. And in the historical books where people were making moves like that, we do have a prophetic word from God on the action to take. And now in Malachi, God tells them to go back and get them wives. How do you reconcile that for these guys to say, this is what we need to do, this is, pull out my hair because I'm ticked off, and then, a couple years later, God's saying, what are you doing? Go back and get your wives. It appears that they made a mistake, a bad leadership call. It appears that they were acting on their own out of zealousness.
Of course, one issue is how and when do we date the book of Malachi? And I would date him earlier, or around 450 or earlier. So he's not maybe dealing with quite the same situation as Nehemiah. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you've mentioned, yes, there doesn't seem to be any, as specific word from God in the same way you find in other books. But I guess I've already said this, but it strikes me that the writing of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and the perspective that we see from the author in the things that the author included and so on is itself God's evaluation on this time, and that Ezra was a scribe rooted in the Torah. Nehemiah was someone very much in tune with God. You see all the prayers that he has. So that I would argue that what Ezra and Nehemiah are doing, they're doing so with the consciousness of their status as God's leaders and trying to be in tune with what God is doing.
It just seems like such a transition from the way we do things back during the day of David, when David would consult God for everything. Nathan would consult God for everything. And this is definitely a different phase in the history of Israel where these two guys, not one place in the book do they thank God, they pray to God, they complain to God. Not one place in either book do they ask God for the right path, when all the rest of them did that. So it makes me wonder, this divorcing of the wives and the foreigners and stuff like that, if they're zealous for their nationality and they're making wrong choices.
Well, certainly they're zealous, and as I said, they're maybe overzealous in the sense of if we're going to err in one direction or the other, we're going to err on the side of being too strict. Whether God was happy with that or not, it's hard to know. My sense is it's analogous to the time of the first Exodus. They're coming out of Egypt. They're coming into a land where it's the issue of contamination with intermarriage with foreigners is a big deal. To protect the fragile sense of Israel's identity politically as well as religiously, that he said, don't intermarry. In fact, matter of fact, wipe them all out.
But Moses married foreign women in the desert.
Yeah, and that's not sanctioned certainly, but it certainly happens, obviously.
So the question is God against interracial marriage?
That's a new question. And believe it or not, I was teaching at the New Orleans Baptist Seminary, late 90s. And I was teaching through Ezra and Nehemiah, and somebody, a white student, asked that question, and he said that he had actually been taught that books of Ezra and Nehemiah prove that interracial marriage is wrong.
But is it wrong from the standpoint where it depletes the bloodline, or it has something to do with intelligence, which is a bunch of malarkey?
I think the prohibition against intermarriage in the Bible is not a matter at all of racial issues. It's a matter of faith. Because it is not, the people of God in the Old Testament is not anybody who is descended by blood from Abraham. It's anyone who has embraced the faith of Abraham. So I've mentioned already, Rahab is an example. Ruth is an example. Other foreigners who embraced the faith of Israel, they were every bit as much Israelites as those who were born Israelite. And the issue of the intermarriage of Philistine women or Ammonite or whoever else was not the fact of their birth or their race per se. It was that more likely than not, they were going to be worshiping other gods. And so the issue is a matter of religious conviction and loyalty, not racial at all. All right, we're picking up. We'll finish off the themes in Ezra and Nehemiah. The whole idea of God's people, united, etc. is important. Obviously, worship is important. The whole issue of reestablishing the temple, the first 6 chapters of Ezra is a big deal there. The celebrations of the different festivals that they did, both in Ezra and Nehemiah, that's all a big deal. The importance of Scripture, certainly. They read the Scripture in Nehemiah 8 and following. Ezra himself was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses and the reading of that and so on. So that's significant. And the idea of expositing the text, explaining it that we've mentioned in Nehemiah 8 verse 8 is they read the law and they made it clear, gave the sense, is important. And a lot of that rejoicing that happened was in combination with the times when they read Scripture and they understood it and heard it. And I think that's really an inspiring thing. I mean, we talked at the beginning of the hour about public reading of Scripture. Some people, some places, churches don't do it very well. Others do it better. But a second issue is when Scripture is read, is there any sense of joy that we derive from it or not? It sometimes is maybe the most dead part of the service, but and I think that's a disease that can infect seminarians, that you're spending all this time, dozens, hundreds of hours studying the Scripture itself in your years at seminary, and it can tend to become a dry thing. But I would certainly say, as you come to it, whether you're working on one passage, one chapter, or whether you're sitting down to read the whole book at one sitting, whatever it is, that your prayer should be, Lord, speak to me in this occasion. Whatever. I think I've already said this, but some of the greatest blessings that I have received personally, in the spiritual blessing sort of sense, has come in the process of preparing for lectures or writing an article, writing a book, and digging deep into it. So there shouldn't be this divide between the academic study and sort of the spiritual blessing that comes out of it. That should be hand in hand with each other. A big issue in Ezra and Nehemiah is prayer. We have several extended prayers preserved. Ezra chapter 9, Nehemiah chapter 9, and other places. There's a lot of short prayers, and I love Nehemiah's prayers. He just sort of says in short bursts, I pray to the Lord and ask Him for guidance, and then he goes on. Or in one place, I prayed to the Lord and set a guard, when they were facing the opposition. So the example, especially of Nehemiah, but also Ezra, is of leaders who are very much in tune with God in the everyday life. They're not sitting necessarily all the time, a separate time away for prayer. And obviously there's a place for that. Daniel did that. Jesus himself retreated to pray on occasion. But there's also a place for sort of a steady stream of conversation with God. So those are important things. And finally, the whole issue of God's grace, the phrase or the statement, the good hand of the Lord our God was upon us. The hand of the Lord, His God, was upon him. Some variation of that occurs 9 times in the 2 books, and it shows, God was favoring His people during this time. And we see the events, when we see the way the events worked out, in spite of the opposition, now and again, things move forward, and things were good. Let me just say one last thing about Ezra and Nehemiah in terms of the historical situation. People have been in exile. They come back in the first part of Ezra. But then there's this 75-year gap or more, really, from Ezra chapter 7 and following, and the book of Nehemiah. We're dealing with 100 years after the return from exile. And so some of the enthusiasm as they first came back and rebuilt that temple had kind of dissipated. And in the book of Nehemiah and the later part of Ezra, there are these problems and these issues that they're facing. And Nehemiah 13 has all those 8 problems that he's having to address. So the spiritual fervor had sort of died down. And these are leaders now having to deal with things again. And there's a sense of sort of revival as the leaders stepped up and did their thing. But it's not a natural thing. Sometimes, of course, revival comes from the ground level up. The Spirit just begins working in individual people's lives. Other times, revival comes more from intentional things or leaders put things into place and lead and provide opportunity for people to be confronted with God in one way or another. Okay, those are the main things I want to say about Ezra and Nehemiah.